Welcome back, everyone. Today's second panel is called The Critique of Media. Each of these presentations addresses inventions and interventions in established and new media, in memes, paintings, and conceptual art, arenas for disruption and for political and visual critique. Our panelists are Carl Down, Rebecca Shakom, and Hannah Waiters. Some words about each of them. Carl Down graduated with a BA in history from Columbia University, where he studied cultural criticism, the history of the American left, and American pragmatism. Carl is also an artist, and he earned an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. His MA thesis research focuses on the socio-political impact of memes in visual culture online. Carl's thesis advisor is Dr. Ignacio Valero, Associate Professor in the Humanities and Sciences Division at CCA. The title of Carl's symposium paper is Hypertruth, 9/11 Conspiracy Memes and Political Subjectivity Online. Our second presenter is Rebecca Shakom. Rebecca Shakom is a San Francisco-based artist and writer. She earned a BFA from San Diego State University and an MFA from San Francisco Art Institute. Her MA thesis research investigates the careers of historical artist Frida Kahlo and the contemporary artist Riva Lera. Rebecca examines self-portraits of these artists and their navigated self-presentations. She shows how Kahlo and Lera alternately reveal and conceal their disabilities. Her thesis advisor is Dr. Jeanette Rowan, Associate Professor in the History and Visual Culture Program at CCA. The title of Rebecca's symposium paper is Frida Kahlo and Her Boots, a person-first analysis of artists with disabilities. Our third presenter is Hannah Waiters, a Bay Area-based visual researcher. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Hannah is also a conceptual artist whose work was featured in the online journal Hyperallergic and exhibited at the De Young Museum of Art in San Francisco in 2020 as well. Last year, she was awarded the Edwin Anthony at Adeline Boudreau Cadogan Award. A dual degree student at CCA, Hannah is also earning an MFA in Fine Arts. Her thesis advisor is Dr. Genevieve Hyacinth, Assistant Professor in the History of Art and Visual Culture Program at CCA. The title of Hannah's symposium presentation is Fire Under Glass, Black Freedom in Edgar Arsenault's Orpheum Returns, Fire's Creation. A reminder, questions and comments are invited and welcome. Please enter them into the Q&A portion of the webinar. After the last pre-recorded presentation, the panelists will join the webinar live and address your questions in there during the 15-minute Q&A session. Carl will start us off.
Hello, my name is Carl Down. My presentation is entitled Hypertruth, 9/11 Conspiracy Memes and Political Subjectivity Online. Before I begin, please note that throughout this presentation, there will be images from the attacks on September 11th. Thank you for being here. 20 years after the attacks, people are still joking about 9/11. On social media, these take the form of 9/11 conspiracy memes. Why do these jokes persist, and why this format? I argue that 9/11 memes reflect an epistemic formation that I call the hypertrue. Discourse is broken down. Anything and everything can be true at once. 9/11 memes generate a hypertrue discourse by assembling seemingly disparate signs into false narratives. What are these 9/11 conspiracy memes doing to the visual field? And what do they say about political subjectivity in the age of social media? This is a foray into a unique and visual form of miscommunication that challenges scholarly assumptions about the anti-authoritarian power of the internet. Here is a 9/11 conspiracy meme from 2015.
Now watch this drive.
This YouTube spoof is called Now Watch This Drive, and it retells the story of 9/11. The video splices associated press footage of a George Bush interview with on-the-ground footage of United Flight 175 slamming into the South Tower. Through an extreme collapse of time, Now Watch This Drive simulates the conspiracist belief that the Bush administration was somehow responsible for 9/11. It begs a reconsideration of two fundamental questions in visual cultural analysis. One, does the image represent reality? And two, does politicizing that image challenge power in any meaningful sort of way? 9/11 conspiracy memes like Now Watch This Drive confound these questions. They may give the public a way to refute official narratives, but they ultimately undermine political consensus with competing representations of reality. Now Watch This Drive is just one in an infinitely replicating pool of 9/11 conspiracy memes. These memes manipulate pop culture, stock photography, and news events to deliver one of three conspiracist punchlines. 1, 9/11 was an inside job. 2, Bush did 9/11. And 3, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. They're populist communiques, and they critique mainstream media, the political elite or deep state, and even 9/11 truthers themselves. Whether ironic or genuine, it's about a public distrust in official narratives. So how did conspiracism get so popular? Jokes about 9/11 are nothing new. Sociologist Ghislaine Kuipers traces them back to just one day after the attacks. These jokes were different in nature, however. They relied on shock humor to downplay the severity of the attacks, or they deployed xenophobic tropes to rally against America's perceived enemies. These tropes persist in 9/11 conspiracy memes today, but something has changed in the last 10 years. Online meme encyclopedia knowyourmeme.com credits the following meme, things a pony would say, with starting that new trend. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams was first uttered in the 2004 9/11 conspiracist documentary Loose Change. Its directors claimed that jet fuel could not have burned hot enough to weaken the tower's structural integrity and precipitate their collapse. Things a pony would say turns this claim into an ironic jab. Reappropriating a comic by illustrator Jim Benton, the meme subverts a little girl's wish to talk to horses by turning that horse into a 9/11 truther. Thus, a new kind of 9/11 joke is born, one that is participatory and self-referential. Things a pony would say uses crude, accessible software and social media to mutate someone else's comic. The creator's intervention leaves a fossil record through layers of pixelated sediment. And primed by a new social media fad of that non sequitur, jet fuel can't melt steel beams, Now Watch This Drive will appear 1 year later to memify its own punchline, Bush did 9/11, using the same aesthetic strategies as Things a Pony would say. At just 6 seconds, Now Watch This Drive flashes across the screen like an intrusive thought. The video spoof is compressed and out of focus. It's cropped too. There's a term for this look. Media journalist Nick Douglas calls it internet ugly. With internet ugly, amateurish execution is the whole point. Compression, maladroit rendering, and slapdash collage are just some of its techniques. 9/11 conspiracy memes deploy internet ugly to combat what Gayatri Spivak calls the museumification of the event. By messing up images sanctified by coffee table books, documentaries, and other official channels, these memes contest how politicians and the media moralize our collective memories of the attacks. In rebuttal, the poor images simulate a populist authenticity to legitimate the idea that 9/11 was an inside job. For example, look at the golf ball here. Superimposed where United Flight 175 should be, this camp touch of continuity represents the bare minimum effort required to link two videos filmed 1 year apart. It is comically large, the creator likely appropriated it from a product shot with cold lighting, and it disappears after 2 frames. For a split second, the viewer can still see the plane colliding with the tower. Yet by pasting this incongruous element over Fairbanks' footage, the creator is indicating that visual fidelity matters less than what the meme is communicating. Now Watch This Drive is a false image. We know this. Its authenticity, however, lies elsewhere. Political scholars Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum identify this discursive schism in what they call the new conspiracism of our times. To the new conspiracist, everything is up for questioning. Though President Bush never hit a golf ball into the towers, now watch this drive is communicating something that might as well be true enough. Take this comment from user Well Golly. The meme they write has a hint of truth to it, but not the 9/11 truther type of truth. To this user, America's growing distrust of their president who didn't work on weekends was vindicated when warnings about Osama bin Laden from the previous administration went unheeded. Now watch this drive constructs its picture of doubt from two clips also found on YouTube. The first is an Associated Press interview with George W. Bush in 2002, conducted from his family's Walker Point estate in Kennebunkport, Maine. The second is on-the-ground footage of the attacks shot by photographer Evan Fairbanks. Fairbanks' footage comes from a deep archive of recorded accounts from 9/11 on YouTube, where users recall where they were that day or the victims that they knew. Yet for some of these commenters, Fairbanks' footage is actually evidence that the attacks were staged. 9/11 conspiracy memes take advantage of this destabilization in the visual field. They infiltrate the archive to generate their revised narratives. In this way, the archive becomes what scholar Lemore Schiffman calls a collection of future images. Any 9/11 video or image holds explosive potential energy to reassemble into new and radically different pictures of reality. 9/11 conspiracy memes are what French postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard would call a form of narrative knowledge. The 9/11 conspiracy meme pays no heed to empirical proof. Rather, it certifies itself, quote, in the pragmatics of its own transmission. The name of the game here is participatory riffing. This meme follows the same format as Now Watch This Drive. Using the last scene from Pixar's Toy Story, it subverts Woody's shock so that when Buzz Lightyear announces, "We're not aiming for the truck," the two slam into the towers. It's culturally legible because we've seen this meme before. And shared across YouTube, Reddit, and Twitter, "We're not aiming for the truck" comes full circle. It incorporates the shock and geopolitical humor identified by Kuipers in early 9/11 jokes with the conspiracism of contemporary 9/11 memes, joking first that someone else must have been behind the attacks, and second, that it was President Bush all along. The result is a self-referential web that instructs us how to read each meme. Today, media scholars praise memes as these DIY discursive sites where web denizens can find camaraderie and reject the status quo. In their canonical essay, Can Jokes Bring Down Governments?, Design Collective Metahaven writes that a meme is self-replicates until it becomes the inescapable, omnipresent truth that hovers over each and every one of your political opponents. But what happens when that joke is a 9/11 conspiracy meme? Can an image that does not depict the truth through repetition alone start to depict a truth again? Though these new conspiracist visual strategies might question official narratives and therefore power itself, Muirhead and Rosenblum would remind us that they also delegitimize democratic institutions and disorient the political subject. 9/11 conspiracy memes aren't necessarily challenging power in a productive way. 9/11 memes have evolved since 2001 to engage conspiracism in an age where political subjects feel increasingly disempowered. In the hypertrue, it's hard to pin down any verifiable reality behind our exploitation. My research asked what these memes can tell us about representation in the visual field. Can image manipulation be a tool to challenge power? 9/11 conspiracy memes offer a case study that refutes the techno-utopian dreams of media scholars. Rather than imagining actionable political futures, users retreat into the catharsis of paranoia, conjuring wild visions of malign actors to avoid reckoning with an attack that many onlookers remarked was unreal or like a movie. How far can a political joke go? I ask us to recall in the last 5 months the false claims of election fraud from politicians and the media, the rise of QAnon's death cult meme symbology, and the riots and murders on January 6, 2021. Or how about the Christchurch shooter who, before storming the mosque, remarked, "Subscribe to PewDiePie," who is perhaps the most famous meme YouTuber of all time and who also happens to be a white supremacist. 9/11 conspiracy memes are telling us that democracy has already failed, that the system has always been rigged, and we're powerless to change it. Ever laugh when you're uncomfortable? What are we masking with humor here? In this 9/11 meme from March 2021, a user relates the moment that President Bush learns of the attacks on 9/11 to actor Chet Hanks' announcement that after everyone is vaccinated, 2021 will be a white boy summer. Hanks asks if we can vibe with his prophetic vision. But as Naomi Fry writes in The New Yorker, what was he asking us to vibe with exactly? The last few years have seen a sharp rise in violent white supremacist actions. This meme feels less like a scathing critique. It reads like a premonition. Still reeling from the attacks which challenged its global eminence, America, it seems, is still struggling to see why it's not okay to say that this summer is going to be a white boy summer. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for being here. In this presentation titled Frida Kahlo and Her Boots, a person-first analysis of artists with disabilities, I discuss the absence of person-first language in scholarly articles and books on Frida Kahlo. Person-first language puts the person before the disability, describing what the person has, not who they are. This analysis of Kahlo allows her to speak on her own behalf through her art. Kahlo's boots are a form of artistic expression, and seen through the lens of disability theory, reveal the artist's agency over her body that past literature has disregarded. Kahlo's art extended to the clothing that adorned her body, from the painted pastor corsets to her custom-made boots. In studying the emergent field of disability theory, it allows for an in-depth analysis. One that allows me to ask, what does art do as a form of self-expression compared to using the medical model of disability? In 2004, curators unlocked an enclosed room in La Casa Azul, Kahlo's longtime home. When they opened this room, scholars gained access to never-before-seen effects, and a new Kahlo had come to life. Among these effects were family photos, articles of clothing, and mobility aids, including what is seen here, a pair of custom-made boots that she wore from 1948 to 1952. At first glance, these boots seem identical, but the right heel is significantly higher than the left. It is unclear who restitched and lifted the fringe above the boot's binding, but the left fringe aligns with the right. The hand stitching looks as though an inexperienced sewer applied the fringe. Without a perfect seam to guide the fringe, the shoemaker sewed it on crooked. The boots have a different effect when they're seen in person, revealing more when you get closer. While fashionable, these boots did serve a practical purpose, to allow Kahlo to walk without limping and appear as if both legs are the same height. With closer analysis, I argue she chose to rearrange the fringe on the back to distract from the differing lengths of her legs. However, she drew attention to her feet with this bright and colorful fuchsia silk. Kahlo concealed her disability and revealed her exaggerated style, both claiming ownership over the looks she would receive. The boots' appearance stand out, enabling onlookers to see something different, something they too could envision themselves walking in. At a young age, Kahlo experienced 2 medical traumas. She contracted polio as a child and at 18 was in a severe bus accident. Kahlo wrote, quote, "No part of my body is perfect, my right leg least of all. My walk is the worst." According to disability theorist and professor of English Leonard Davis writes that the issue of disability is complex, but in its simplest terms, disability is defined as a person with a visible physical impairment, someone with a sensory or mental impairment, such as having trouble hearing, seeing, or processing information. Davis believes that disability is not an object, like a woman with a cane, but a social process that intimately involves everyone who has a body and lives in the world of senses. Many Kahlo scholars have written texts that pathologize Kahlo based on the narrow scope of artifacts and art through the years, including this book here, which is a biography written to describe most of Kahlo's life, written by Hayden Herrera. After Herrera's publication, Kahlo became more than just a well-known Mexican painter. She attained posthumous worldwide celebrity. The biography positions the reader as a witness to Kahlo's life and death. Another is her sketchbook, which reads like a personal diary. And lastly, a publication of her medical records and psychological tests, which were published by psychiatrist and Kahlo admirer Solomon Greenberg. Access to these sketchbooks, personal letters, and private records entails a level of power and an invasion of Kahlo's privacy. I argue that the narrow scope found in these books are based on the medical model of disability. According to disability theory by Tobin Sabers, the medical model defines disability as an individual's problem. It argues that any person with disability is defective and must find a cure to live. To take part in society, the individual must amend their own body. In contrast, the social model opposes the medical model by defining it relative to the social and built environment, arguing that disabling environments produce disability in bodies and require interventions at the level of social justice. Disability or illness is seen primarily as a medical issue. And what disability studies does is it refuses the medicalization and reframes disability as a political and social issue. The desired approach to viewing Kahlo and her work is through the social model, which includes a recognition of historical context and environment, and by letting her speak on her behalf through her art. Many scholars focus on Kahlo's body as a site of pain, and creating her art was a way of overcoming that pain. The field of disability studies highlights how bodies are viewed through this ableist lens. Ableism is defined as discrimination in favor of the non-disabled body. Disability activist and author Simi Linton would add that ableism also includes the idea that people with disabilities are inferior to non-disabled bodies. Many in the field of disability studies aim to define disability as a social process, not a diagnosis. The overcoming rhetoric claims that people with disabilities must look as though their illnesses no longer limit them. In Kahlo's case, she's recognized as someone who overcame so much pain and brokenness and became the successful artist despite her illness. Yet what happens as a result of the overcoming rhetoric in her is her pain is exaggerated or overlooked. Her body is then fetishized because she created a vast amount of work that made her famous. Kahlo's boots are not a symbol of overcoming her disability, but an example of living and thriving with a disability. She is incorporating an innovative perspective and tools at her disposal to gain agency over her body. Kahlo communicates to the viewer how she experiences her disabilities through her art, while also teaching the viewer how to look at her body. Here we see a drawing titled "Appearances Can Be Deceiving." This drawing is rendered in pencil and crayon on paper. The self-portrait depicts Kahlo wearing a sheer dress, thus making her body visible. She's wearing a traditional green tejana dress, evident in the structure of the skirt and ruffles. This dress encases the body and at the same time reveals it through transparency. In real life, her dress would conceal her body, protecting her disabilities from being seen. Here, she reveals her back brace, which she wore for support. In revealing her corset, and cracked column for her spine and naked legs, Kahlo expresses that there is more to her dress. In comparison, taken from the commonly sourced biography, Herrera writes, quote, "In a sense, Frida was like a Mexican piñata, a fragile vessel decorated with frills and ruffles, filled with sweets and surprises, but destined to be smashed." Here, Herrera chooses to see her pain as deficiency by stating that her body is this fragile thing and that is destined to be annihilated. Herrera believes that Kahlo is using clothing as a form of deception, which in actuality, concealing the body with special clothing or exaggerating body parts are standard practices for people with disabilities. Kahlo's boots, for example, are not deceptive, but a tool for concealing, as a direct result of ableism and shame placed on the disabled body for being seen as othered. One contemporary artist that explains these strategies with clothing is Riva Layer. Here we see her custom patent leather boots with rainbow shoelaces. Her combat-style boots call attention to themselves with pride. Layer says she wears them even though she's aware people are staring at her boots. In one explanation as to why people conceal with clothing, Layer writes, quote, "Crip girls wear plunging necklines to draw the eyes away from our bent backs. Long velvet skirts cascade over our leg braces. We use magic spells and incantations to make the rest of us disappear." Layer's remarks on clothing parallel Kahlo's stylistic choices by calling this revealing and concealing strategy magic. That said, Layer has the advantage of being part of the now recognized disability culture, one in which she can either choose to reveal or conceal her disabilities. Today, Layer continues to use her art to advocate for not only her body, but for people with disabilities. In Layer's virtual book launch for her memoir, Golem Girl, she says that, quote, "People who are different, in the context that they are told they are different, become extremely aware of themselves and how they are looked at." Unfortunately, in society today, appearance matters. Disabled bodies are often objectified, criticized, or ignored. Layer asserts that her art is political and thus necessary because she creates portraits of bodies in ways that extol their individuality by making them visible, not to be read as if they were in pain or to elicit pity, but to lift up their bodies. People who are disabled know what it's like to be looked at as different. Layer argues that they should be seen and recognized as human, not ostracized. Both Frida Kahlo and Riva Layer use their art as ways to communicate. They teach us how to look at the disabled body in artwork and, as a result, in everyday life. This is a person-first analysis of both artists because it allows them to speak on their own behalf. Kahlo lived in a time when people with disabilities did not have the same resources some have today. In the great amount of literature written about Kahlo, scholars insert their own assumptions and invade her privacy by publishing private records. Recent scholarship has begun to incorporate disability studies language into research on Kahlo. Nevertheless, I assert that we could do more to recognize Kahlo's identity, which extends far beyond her pain and broken body, by using what Layer argues, that each individual should be seen and recognized as human. Kahlo created awareness around her body the best way she could for her time. She made shoes with fringe that would jingle when she walked, and she used bright, colorful silk to embellish her feet. Kahlo wore these boots to accommodate her uneven legs and incorporated them into her everyday style. This is an example of living and thriving with a disability. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hannah Waiters, and thank you for being here today to talk about the legacies of Black American conceptualism. specifically in relation to cultural legacies preserving 19th century frames of Euro-American art. My title refers to the discourses of reading Black American erasures in cultural and fine art institutions with long and complicated genealogies in the timeline of conceptual art history. For this lecture, I am discussing the work of Edgar Arsenault, a Black conceptual artist who showcases this theme in his 2010 sculptural still life, Orpheum Returns Fire's Creation. I will examine the potentialities of silenced Black narratives, visuality, Black conceptual art practice, through the theoretical frameworks responding to the historiography of dominance of white male conceptual art hegemony of the late 1960s and 80s. For this lecture, I contextualize these institutional discourses and modes of display at that time. Orpheum Returns Fire's Creation is a sculptural still life shaped like a wooden museum display case and capped with a glass vitrine, with cracked clay that covers the vitrine's basin. Arsenault placed a textbook entitled Fire, partially glazed in sugar and off-center in the vitrine. I will offer a critical reading of this piece relevant to Black conceptualism, drawing upon disciplines of art history, conceptual installation art practices, museum studies praxis, and Black Atlantic philosophy. This tension of institutional effort at erasure of Black presence collides with marginalized Black art agents' efforts to resist erasure and its trauma-inducing violences. This composition therefore reflects Scientific American's 1985 text Fire. We see it here by John W. Lyons, which details combustion chemistry and fundamental physics by way of case studies from said, quote, industrial countries of the world. Slightly at left, the book stands partially open, vertically, and is permitting a partial view of its pages. Crystallized sugar coats half of the book, partially concealing only the handheld side. Arsenault assaulted the book by glazing it with heated and liquefied sugar, performing partial erasures that paradoxically imbued its historical material identity. Rather than frustrating the viewers by completely covering the book with the information on its pages, he entices the viewers' focused engagement with the museological installation. What remains legible after the book's exposure to such violence and erasure? Like the speed of a growing flame, the danger of fire for marginalized communities remained one of increasing urgency. Taking this kind of reasoning into account, I will now describe two case studies in the textbook that Arsenault examined for his display that reclaims Black histories and the right to tell them inside and outside of the art institution. Lyons opens with a case study that speaks to modern fire technology and its developments in America. He states, controlled fires serve each American yearly with the electrical and mechanical energy of nearly 100 slaves. The first case study is this infrared image you see captioned here, with a surprising and suspect comparison dispassionately referencing enslaved labor in America, and offers no critique of its place in nation building. His naively scientific tone on the support of fire and catastrophe, preserved in marginalized communities, has a very precise objective, which has materialized into a kind of visceral immediacy by way of sugar's decomposing nature. Accordingly, I foreground what my extension of fire's allusions Arsenault makes to Black urban contexts under the conditions of Black conceptualism, artwork preserved under glass in cultural institutions. The second case study evaluates various materials used to manufacture a new fire-resistant subway system. According to Lyons, in the 1960s, San Francisco and Oakland built this system completely new and was the first to be constructed in the United States in nearly half a century. These marvelous trains belong to the Bay Area Rapid Transit, or BART. Lyons champions industrial progress of fire prevention initiatives, like the National Bureau of Standards production of full-size fire tests via these case studies. He offers chemical data and physical diagrams referencing fire-tested materials in BART cars. In this book, Lyons includes a black and white photograph of a burnt BART car, largely serving Black and brown neighborhoods. It demonstrates the aftermath of a catastrophic fire from 1979. In the photo, the BART's car's hull is ravaged with, I quote, smoke so thick it looks like black ink, end quote. The car's monochromatic image was taken in 1979 at the Fruitvale stop in Oakland, best known for the BART police shooting of Oscar Grant. Arsenault likely noticed Lyons' offhand characterization and celebrations of scientific advancements. The photo depicts the destruction of a high voltage and electrical circuit sparked and caused a massive fire that started on the seat cushion and spread up the walls, causing several casualties and one fatality. The fire destroyed the ceiling of the car, leaving cables hanging haphazardly and several rows of seats nearly obliterated. It stands in as a register for Black urban vulnerability, one of whom governmental fire initiatives came too late. Preserving such a case study under glass brings me to one of the most important theories this work is indebted to. Towards the notion of fire under museum glass, I apply Jennifer Gonzalez's reading of Fred Wilson's comparable art process as one of conceptual materialism to Arsenault's approach. Key in this argument is Gonzalez's theoretical framework of Fred Wilson's art practice as one of conceptual materialism, and is the lens in which I view Arsenault's practice. Gonzalez writes of Wilson's conceptual materialist practice, which we see modeled here in Speaking in Tongues, a look at a language of display, as an exhibition that took place at the DeYoung Museum in 1999 or 1998, and Wilson mined deep storage of the museum and made a display of European and Euro-American arts in the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. Here we see another Black conceptual materialist artist of Arsenault's generation, employing techniques in African, Oceanic, and Native American galleries. Wilson arranged the gallery space with white plinths, topped with glass cases that gallery goers may circumambulate. While Wilson places the artworks within many of the display cases, others are empty, and in this way they look robbed of their artifacts. The gallery spotlight shines onto each vitrine, highlighting this absence. One views each glass case through the reflection of another. Here, he reveals museums' incomplete art historical archives and, quote, institutional silences, and in so doing draws our attention to the power of museums to decide what is worthy of preservation and display. Thus, a conceptual materialist practice is a radical intervention that inserts cultural differences into canonical museum archives. And so Arsenault's similar plexiglass vitrine confronts these biases and blind spots, or intentional erasures, of art historical institutions, archives, and discourses. My thinking about Arsenault's palpable registration of violence under plexiglass with Orpheum Returns Fire's Creations archive, in the form of ossified literary sculptures being eaten away by sugar, was in part informed by Anthony Ryan Hatch's study on sugar and Valerie Cassell Oliver's curation of Arsenault's work in the relation to historiography of Black American conceptualism. This brings me to an earlier work by Arsenault, shown here, a failed attempt at crystallization. Firstly, Hatch writes about the history of degradation from the planting, refining, and consumption of sugar that has historically created fragility in Black American life. With Hatch's idea in mind, Arsenault's visceral conceptual materialist practice allows audiences to, on an artistic scale, sensorially experience the history of vulnerability and disintegration of Black life in America. Unlike Orpheum Returns Fire's creation, Arsenault's A Failed Attempt at Crystallization has a basin composed of a mirror and an opening atop the plexiglass vitrine that allows a sensorial response to the conceptual material of sugar, allowing the aroma of candied sugar to fill the space. Curator Valerie Cassell Oliver's exhibition titled Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art Since 1970, included this work and examined Black conceptual art's placement in the artistic genealogical record within the framework of the sociologist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois that he proposed in The Souls of Black Folk. Oliver's curation and writing of the exhibition was made possible by conceptual artists of Arsenault's generation like Charles Gaines, who is Arsenault's mentor, David Hammonds, and Adrian Piper. Using the theory of double consciousness, Du Bois argued that Black Americans experience the world through a kind of said two-ness. One feels his two-ness, American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. Two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The chronology of American conceptual art through a doubly conscious lens recognizes contradictions of race and Blackness. Therefore, the preservation of a refractive and decomposing text is a metaphor for experiencing canonical archival history through a multitude of perspectives. As this lecture largely troubles and confronts the gaps in the historiography of Black conceptualism and its modes of displaying historical materials in America, a hero in this field of historical phenomenology being the visceral experience of history and historical material, is Kara Walker, Consider both Arsenault's sculptural still lifes in relation to Carol Walker's A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, because they approach a kind of historical phenomenology, a kind of perceived and experienced of history that's visceral. A Subtlety was an iconic site-specific installation in an industrial warehouse in the Domino Sugar Company on the East River in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. 13 molasses colored boys posed like workers coming in from the sugar cane field, foregrounded a 35-foot-tall sugar baby. The colossal sculpture was a black woman nude, wearing a kerchief like a mammy. Her body comprised of polythene cubes of raw cane sugar delivered from the Caribbean to store a unit of sugar. Art historian Krista Thompson has written that Walker destabilizes Italian Renaissance and European Enlightenment art historical traditions, disrupting, quote, linear narrative history of European art conventions of landscape and genre painting. I argue that Arsenault works in this way, particularly the cover of the textbook, Fire, where we see here a crop detail of the French Baroque painter Georges de Latour's oil painting, Magdalene with a Smoking Flame. The carefully placed book sits atop clay in a liminal wasteland that resembles the look of those created according to the paradox of fire's aftermath, one that simultaneously points to demolition and renewal. Furthermore, I view Arsenault's firing liquid sugar across the text Fire as an irresolute map of the imagined histories annotated out of a narrative that looks frozen or even suspended in time. Orpheum Returns Fire's creation evokes a confrontation with the fire-destroyed landscape, especially those spaces and places where Black and Brown people have lived and worked. I argue that Arsenault's version of Black American history looks like Orpheum Returns Fire's creation, a concealed industrial history that has in part experienced fire's force of erasure, preserved as a material critique of art institutions. Figuratively, the museological display case is a metaphor for preserving and continuing the legacy of catastrophe and erasure in Black American neighborhoods. I offer a way of thinking about what it means to formally and conceptually place the legacy of fire's aftermath, resulting in Black American erasure, under museum glass. It goes like this. Set the book of fire, ossify its biases in a molten sugar shower, not to erase them, but to leave the entrails of a fading supremacy of cultural institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, Rebecca, and Hannah. Let's bring all three of you back on camera. And in the interim, please give these panelists a hearty round of applause. So we have about till 1 p.m. for questions. I'm going to start my timer. Please, for attendees, feel free to put your questions and comments in the Q&A section, and I will monitor them. Let's see if there is one. I think there is one in there already, or two for these panelists. From Patricia Lang, Carl, great presentation. What do you envision as a societal way of dealing with the effects of visual conspiracy theories? What will the drive for increased digital literacies be replaced by psychovisual therapies that address human need for perpetuating conspiracies? What will save democracy? Oh, you got that, right?
Oh my God, with just a master's degree. It's a really good question, and I think it's central to sort of the work of this research. One of the terrifying aspects of memes is that they really distort the visual field and how we do democracy online, how we talk to each other, how we do politics, period. And they do that by making what's agreeable, what's consensus, all the more confusing. There is none. But I think the question isn't necessarily, is there a way forward through consolidating around some sort of agreement in culture, but instead learning how to use these images as means to imagine new political futures and redirecting the fact that meaning now can differ wildly across whatever image or sign you're using in a meme. So if that's the case, it's less to try to work backwards from that and go to some sort of like conservative past where, you know, truth was truth, and, you know, tradition was tradition, but more, how do we use this malleability towards actually realizing political futures? How do you make a meme that is truly future oriented? How do you imagine with it? How do you make the fact that life is always in flux actually productive? I think it's about training that instead of sort of clutching one's pearls at the way in which, you know, the alt-right figure might be so much more adept at twisting meaning.
Thank you, Carl. We have a question for all three panelists from Kathy Zarur. Congratulations on such strong presentations. Each of your presentations involved a careful balance of theory, historical context, the visual, and materiality. Because I worked with you all on your thesis last semester, I know that each of you have arrived at this moment having prioritized one over the other. Can you talk about the process? What have you learned about the importance of the visual in relation to the historical context? Maybe because Carl just answered a question, either Becca or Hannah could start off with a response to this one.
I could go. Well, I think with Frida Kahlo, it's really important to understand her environment at the time in Mexico. So historical context was really important in comparison to Rivalier, who is a contemporary artist. And also Rivalier has a platform to stand on. Riva is very famous within disability culture, and rightfully so. She's an incredibly talented artist. And she also has tools like social media, and she has a memoir where she gives her own account of disability and growing up with spina bifida and you know, the amount of surgeries. So I think with Kahlo, we really have just her artwork and her artifacts, as well as some of her personal letters, to really kind of to take from. We don't really have a personal account. We don't have like a memoir that Kahlo wrote. So there can be some assumptions in understanding Kahlo's disability and life experience. So I think for me, it was really important to extract from what Laer says and kind of utilize that and use that towards Kahlo's experience as much as I could, and allow Kahlo to speak on her own behalf in her own experience with disability.
Thank you for that question, Kathy. I personally, one of the reasons I was so interested in Orpheum Returns Fire's creation and overall Edgar Arsenault's oeuvre is because his work is dealing with this type of historical materiality, which was, I guess, my starting point for this research, which moved through his archive of works like the Library of Black Lies, which was in my thesis, Detroit, which was a large-scale drawing, which appropriated Walter de Maria's mile-long drawing that took place in the Mojave Desert. So moving through these different types of media brought me to this point with studying Orpheum Returns Fire's creation really closely and expanding these notions of conceptual materialism and more largely historical materialism through the visuals of Arsenault's vast archive, his vast visual archive. And so I think that the visceral and materiality of Arsenault's work, for this work in particular, was really important because it allowed this sense of space and experience and historical experience for the viewer and for museums to invest in what this type of preservation can look like through these new conceptual materialist techniques and dynamics that involve the art historian, they involve the curator, and they most importantly involve the Black conceptual artist.
Thank you, Hannah. We have a question for Carl from Ignacio Valero. In very preliminary terms, how do you think your concept of hyper-truth within the context of a hyper-visual digital culture and conspiracism might be mobilized to resist authoritarian populism and surveillance capitalism and improve democracy.
Another tall order.
There you go.
I think, I mean, it builds off of Professor Lang's question previously, but in thinking about hypertruth, which is this term I use in my thesis and my sightlines research to try to describe the way in which meaning is very malleable today. We see in memes how a lot of different realities can come into play at once, particularly 9/11 memes, where one person can look at the meme and see a conspiracy, can see and believe that somehow the Bush administration was responsible for that image. And on the other hand, someone could read that meme and say, you know, that's hilarious. 9/11 meme, or like 9/11 truthers or people who believe that are crazy. And this meme is funny because I think that they're crazy. Both of those interpretations or readings are in play at once. In that way, it's kind of hypertrue in the sense that we now have these images that operate on multiple registers whenever they're read online. What that does for conspiracism is it gives it a platform to breed alongside critique, and it like necessarily confuses what we can hold as true or form consensus around when we engage on Instagram or Reddit or Twitter or what have you. When it comes to actually mobilizing that hypertrue discourse towards actually resisting populism and surveillance capitalism, I think it goes back to my answer to Professor Lang. It's about learning how to use signs and images that can be recruited into any narrative towards productive narratives, rather than maybe thinking about trying to unmask who's behind the curtain. I think there's after 9/11, life in the West became, in the visual world, very starkly precarious. It had always been precarious, especially for certain populations. But after 9/11, it became quite all the more spectacular between the murder of Black Americans by police, COVID, and war on terror. How we respond to that, it looks like an answer to the hypertruth, I think.
Thank you, Carl. To the question of Viet Le, which speaks to strategies as well. Professor Le writes, wonderful presentations. Each of your papers gesture, this is for all three people, each of your papers gesture at strategies in rethinking histories and audiences. How do memes, for Carl, conceptual installations, for Hannah, and archives, for Rebecca, let us reconsider strategies of concealing, / revealing for your work as artists academics?
For me personally, I use conceptual as a practicing artist and researcher. Conceptual art, and especially in this case, allows the possibility or allows artistic dynamics of unfinishedness to continue to critique the institution in a subtle way. Those who are familiar with Gordon Meta-Clark's work, even though this is not necessarily mentioned in my thesis, and are familiar with David Hammond's newest work, that is an homage, but also a critique of the time of conceptual art of Gordon Meta-Clark's Day's End, which is being right now commissioned by the Whitney, is speaking to these ideas of how unfinishedness, that physical sense of unfinishedness in conceptual art, how it can be utilized and then funded by institutions as a subtle way of critiquing these timelines, but also going back and re-examining what these conceptual art practices did, both Black and white, during the civil rights movement, specifically for the sake of this paper. But I do really think that David Hammond specifically, and of course Edgar Arsenault, are getting at these ideas of unfinishedness in a new way that specifically can critique the genealogy of conceptual art history in 2021.
I think in regards to my research and on Frida Kahlo specifically, I kind of came to this realization that she had been exposed or revealed too much, not on her own, but through the investigation of wanting to know who she is. I think of the book by Solomon Greenberg. He printed and published her private medical records and psychological tests. So I think there's been this kind of dissection of Kahlo that's been revealed too much. And I compare that to her boots and how just by the restitching of the fringe from, if you were an onlooker and you saw her from afar, you wouldn't necessarily notice that the shoes were different lengths or different heights. It would have to be of closer analysis where you could see the difference. So to me, that would mean that, you know, Kala would rather conceal in her everyday appearance rather than what's kind of happened because of her fame or cult-like status that's happened. And she's so far removed, I believe, from the person that she was when she was alive because of books and publications of these personal medical records.
I think to that point, it comes down to, for me, what these memes are masking in political culture and what they're sort of standing in for. And from a very top-down picture, they ultimately sort of stand in for or mask our failure of political imagination to think outside of the neoliberal state. It's to think outside of a conception of belonging in a state which administers life and death, which, you know, passes Patriot Acts or suspends habeas corpus in Black sites. And it represents this inability to think of ourselves outside of that paradigm, to try to organize around a belief in people to secure life or for each other and to protect the sacredness of life, rather than the state, which we end up through these conspiracy memes always believing has an ulterior motive and has it out for us. You know, there's the deep state that puts 5G microchips in people with COVID vaccines, right? Like there's that conspiracy. There's this sense that we can't trust the state, but we can't also trust ourselves to imagine an alternative. And I think that's what these memes are essentially standing in for.
This is unfortunately a lightning round question because we have less than 1 minute. So each of you have about 25 seconds. 20. From Thomas Hawkinson, really fascinating, informative presentations all the way around. Kudos to this panel. I'm curious about the way in which these projects sometimes implicitly address the idea of expertise. Can you share some ideas for how we might employ and use the knowledge produced by experts, political, medical, or otherwise, even as encouragement of critical awareness of unquestioned political or medical expertise?
I think for my quick response to that, when I think about disability, I think about how it really it affects everybody. It's something that's like the aging process is disability, is a form of disability. So you don't necessarily have to be an expert to understand illness or any kind of form of disability. It can either affect you personally or it can affect family members. So I feel like there has been in a lot of the readings that I've done, you know, there's kind of this staking the claim, like why it is that you have this power to talk about what the claim you're making about disability studies or feminist disability studies, like where are you situated within the knowledge of knowing? And I feel like everybody kind of already somehow is affected by it and is somehow affected by how people perceive disability. So you don't necessarily need to be an expert. You can just be a human, understanding that we're all different and we all have uniqueness.
So I'm really fascinated by that question, and that's something I'm going to continue to think about in that framework of expertise. For me personally, and for the sake of the ongoingness of this project, I'm most interested in the expertise, I guess, of the art historian, and how Julian Myers-Shukinska's artistic dynamic with Edgar Arsenault has expanded his artistic practice, and how these ongoing artistic dynamics can continue or can be used in new generations of conceptual materialists that are, you know, coming in after Edgar Arsenault, and now taking place in this time and space of redesigning the museum and redesigning these institutions. What conceptual materialist dynamics can look like now? So I guess thinking about like what new conceptual materialism can look like through the guidance of eminent art historians and ongoing collaboration projects. Thank you for that question.
Tom, I don't know. Institutions are popular in participatory frameworks, right? Like how we do democracy necessarily involves what we give to democracy as a collective. It's not necessarily this top-down thing which organizes us, but should be the product of our collective organization. That gets really difficult when the internet gives everyone a voice, and when everyone having a voice starts to look like conspiracism. People like Fred Richin at NYU wanted to put tamper marks on altered photographs to try to alert the public to a manipulation in an image. News organizations will live fact check debates. Those are necessarily institutions that have authority and some sort of objective lens on the information that we consume, whether it's written, televisual, or in an image. But I don't necessarily know if there's an answer to that question when we don't inherently trust even those institutions anymore. I think, the whole point of Internet Ugly as a meme aesthetic is to challenge even the veracity of like a high quality image that might come from CNN or might come from a documentary or a coffee table book, specifically, looking back on 9/11. So even when the image itself can be institutionalized in high quality, I actually don't have a question, and I want to think about that more deeply. An answer to that question, I want to think about it more deeply, because popularizing image making has really upended how we even do trust. Authority has to be a popular thing, but how do you get to popular authority when meaning is so always in play?
Thank you, three. Thank you for such a rich panel, and of course, following up on the strengths of panel one and leading toward panel three. Thank you, everybody. And we will start at 15 past the hour. That's 1:15 here in San Francisco Pacific time. So our break is about 11 minutes. We'll see you soon. Thank you.